Thank you very much to QED for the invitation and to ALP for the introduction. So I'm going to keep this fairly short because in large part I agree with most of the things that colleagues have already said, and I don't think there's any need to labour points that others have made perfectly eloquently. So I will perhaps speak a little more about issues that concern submission-based benchmarks, as my colleagues here come from companies that are best known for transaction-based benchmarks, which present a different set of challenges. So Thomson Reuters is very deeply involved with benchmarks. We have been involved with benchmarks for around 30 years, and we cover all aspects. We act as the collector of data that goes into benchmarks. We act as the calculator. We act as the administrator of many benchmarks. And we act as the distributor. When we do this for thousands of benchmarks across every asset class, equity, fixed income, commodities, interest rates. And we do this in an extremely wide range of markets around the world. We are almost unique in that we are already regulated by the FCA for the administration and calculation of benchmarks, and we are working closely with regulators around the world where we are expecting to see regulation coming in. So the purpose of this is to share some thoughts and experiences. We believe we're quite well placed to work with everybody in the financial community because as our involvement of benchmarks is in all parts of the process, Thomson Reuters itself has no position. We have no conflict of interest. So we are merely attempting to provide the best data that can be provided for the benefit of all market participants. So let's start off with the use of benchmarks. It's clearly very important to ensure that market participants are using appropriate benchmarks. And the first step in this is to understand who is using what benchmarks, for what purposes, and what is the size of the interest, to use the term. We are not sure, as Thomson Reuters, that it is fully understood what a challenge just this actually represents. And that's particularly for benchmarks used in the OTC space. It's going to be quite easy for new benchmarks that are introduced because it will be possible for a benchmark administrator to assert a degree of control over who uses their benchmarks. But that's very different for benchmarks that are already entrenched into the financial system. There is traditionally no requirement for anybody using a benchmark to tell the administrator that they're using it, or what they're using it for, or how many contracts that they have, or how many mortgages that they have that reference a given benchmark. This means that it's very, very hard to judge what is a major benchmark if your criteria for a major benchmark is based purely on assets under management or the number of contracts trading. We would also state that there's not necessarily any direct correlation between the amount of assets that are connected or marked against a given benchmark and the inherent risk that is carried by that benchmark. Some benchmarks are simply less risky than others by the nature of either the market on which they are based or the methodology which they are able to adopt. So, for example, Alp earlier quoted the figure of 400 trillion marked against Euribor and LIBOR, and this is a figure that's it's a real echo chamber because we've all seen that figure quoted repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. I've not actually seen the research that actually underpins that says that that is exactly the right number. And if it is the right number, that number doesn't seem to go up or go down. It must. We've been through a financial crisis. Assets have gone up, assets have gone down. That number doesn't seem to change. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's a very, very hard number to measure accurately. So there's a second issue that I'd like to touch on, which is restrictions on the use of benchmarks. There are clearly very valid questions around ensuring that benchmarks are fit for purpose, and about how a regulator deals with a benchmark from a third country. Now, again, as colleagues have said, the easiest way of doing this is to try and ensure that, as far as is possible, we have one set of standards that are put in place around the world. But, of course, balanced against that, it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all. We feel that the best place to start is the IOSCO principles, and I'm not just saying that because ALP is sat there in front of us. We need to acknowledge the reality of where we are. Markets are global, and whilst there are, of course, many benchmarks that are intentionally niche benchmarks that address a small area of the markets, be it an asset class, be it a territory, benchmarks are often global. If you restrict the use of third country benchmarks, you fragment liquidity, you raise barriers to entry, you inhibit price discovery, you also create an enormous amount of duplication if you have to have a Thai stock index that's calculated in Thailand for use by Thais, and you have another one that's calculated in Europe by use for Europeans. It's difficult. I mean, this actually risks having real economic impact upon European companies. Plus, the cross-border issue is really difficult to define. Is a benchmark within Europe if the global top company of the administrator is European? Or is a benchmark European because the server on which it is physically calculated sits in a European country? Or is it European because the group of individuals who control that benchmark are themselves European? And again, then you flip the coin, and then you have exactly the same question as applies to the use of benchmarks. Is it European if two traders who are using the benchmark happen to be physically in Europe? Or if the two traders using a benchmark happen to be employed by a European country? Or is it a European benchmark if it is used to determine the interest payments on a mortgage on a house in Spain? These are all questions that are going to need to be resolved, and in many cases they're not going to have simple and easy answers. The third point I'd like to touch on is around controls about who submits data. And the aim here is quite clearly very obvious, and it's not controversial. Accurate and reliable benchmarks need accurate and reliable inputs. In deeply liquid markets where benchmarks are based on transactions, this is not difficult, particularly if the transactions originate from venues or platforms that are themselves already regulated. But not all markets are like that. Some markets are smaller, some markets are less liquid, some markets are liquid at certain times and illiquid at others. It's not a problem because that's just the nature of different markets, and in any case there's not a lot that we can do about this unless we actually go as far as collectively deciding that we're going to shut these markets down. A fundamental point here, it's not the case that a benchmark is inherently more reliable if it is based on transactions than, say, expert opinion that is developed in a well-controlled, well-governed framework. Transactions can be stale. Transactions can be manipulative. And also you have the issue about what's liquid now may not be liquid tomorrow, 5 years, next time we have a financial crisis. I think that I've not heard the formulation before, but it's a very neat way of putting it. If there is no traffic, how do we measure the speed? Which captures this brilliantly, and also leads us on to think a number of benchmarks are used for very long-term purposes. Obviously, mortgages last 25, 30 years. If you use a benchmark against a market that's liquid now, will it still be liquid in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time? Another big problem. Where you find benchmarks that are based on submissions, there is a very real tension. Clearly, you wish to exert the maximum amount of control over your submitters to that benchmark, but doing so inevitably disincentivizes those submitters. It is very onerous, it's very resource intensive to submit benchmarks in a regulated environment. However, if you have a less intensive control regime, you might possibly not be able to prevent attempted manipulation. The reality is that every benchmark everywhere that is based on submissions is struggling badly to maintain a representative pool of submitters. We see this everywhere. And in certain cases, it may be possible to address this by mandating submission. We see that in the UK, there is a power reserved to mandate submission into LIBOR, and we believe that it's likely this is going to happen in Singapore as well. But that's for a handful of benchmarks. Can you really do that? We heard that there's 1 million equity benchmarks. Do you really want to try and mandate submission to 1 million equity benchmarks? I mean, arguably that's not a problem because many of them are transaction-based. But Thomson Reuters operates hundreds of benchmarks that are based on submissions. Is it appropriate to try and mandate submission to all of those? Is it even something that you would want to try and do? I mean, we find that even when you go as far as creating a submitter code of conduct and making that available to your submitters and saying, here is a submitter code of conduct, will you follow that? That immediately focuses attention on these benchmarks. And in certain cases, it raises questions amongst the community of submitters to that benchmark as to whether they want to continue to submit. You obviously also have an enormous free rider process. If you say, right, here's a group of people who are going to submit to a benchmark, we will mandate it, they have the additional cost and risk of submitting, and then there's a much bigger group of people over here who don't submit. Is that fair? I think that's an open question that we've yet to resolve. I think the final point I'd like to talk about is the issue of who should audit contributed data. Now, in Thomson Reuters' view, this is something that should be done by all stakeholders playing a role. Data contributors should be confident they have strong controls around who should submit data. That's not particularly difficult. That's largely a technological challenge, and it's something that certainly Thomson Reuters has been able to help its submitters with. There should be internal and, in some cases for major benchmarks, external review about the submissions. Administrators of benchmarks should provide strong challenge to the inputs into those benchmarks, and that should be both pre-calculation and post-calculation. We feel that supervisors have a role to play here as well. But finally, users of benchmarks should themselves carry out due diligence on the benchmarks that they use. Whether this should be as far as actually reviewing the inputs is debatable, but they should certainly understand in detail the way that their benchmarks are put together. But I've heard recently supervisors saying that this presents a real challenge because you end up with a game of pass the parcel. Because your asset manager says, well, the provider of my benchmark should be the person who makes sure that it's all fine. Or maybe it should be the ultimate person who buys the assets. Maybe it should be their fault, up to them. The benchmark administrator says, well, it should be the asset manager because they're the person who chooses to use the benchmark. And the end user says, well, actually, I don't care, I don't want to know, I just want this problem to go away. One final point here. Nobody has yet identified manipulation of a benchmark by analysing the data. Every single investigation so far has turned on recordings of conversations or emails or message logs. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't try to analyse and scrutinise and challenge the data that goes into benchmarks. Clearly you should. If for no other reason than it tends to catch fat finger errors, the gross errors of the people just submitting accidentally incorrect data. The point here is twofold. You should make it as difficult as possible for those who wish to attempt to manipulate benchmarks as possible, but also, as explicitly stated in the UK Fair and Effective Markets Review, all stakeholders in benchmarks should be seeking to design incentives to change the attitudes and behaviours that make people want to manipulate in the first place. And at that point, I think I should probably leave it. Thank you very much.